The town of Silver Brook, Oregon, nestled in the pine-covered hills of the Willamette Valley, was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change. Main Street still had its red brick diner, its barbershop with a striped pole, and the same soft echo of distant train horns that had drifted through town for decades. And on the afternoon of March 3rd, 1992, when 8-year-old Evan Keller set off from his house to walk the short distance to his grandmother's, just 2 blocks away, no one thought to worry. He had made the trip countless times before. He wore his favorite jacket, a deep forest green with a yellow zipper, and carried a small keychain in the pocket, a plastic bauble with his school's name and a cartoon eagle mascot on it. It was something he never left home without. A birthday gift from his grandma the year before. His mother waved to him from the porch, holding a dish towel in one hand. "Be good," she called. Evan grinned and ran down the steps. He never arrived. By nightfall, the panic had set in. By morning, every neighbor, friend, and off-duty officer had joined the search. Volunteers scoured streets, yards, and nearby woods. Drainage ditches were emptied, abandoned sheds checked, local rivers were dragged, and road signs flashed missing child across the state. Evan's face was plastered on flyers, bulletin boards, even milk cartons. The plastic keychain became a symbol for the case. But no footprints were found, no bike tracks, no witnesses. Evan Keller had vanished, midway between home and his grandmother's, without sound, without sign. The days turned to weeks. Hope turned into ritual. Every year, his parents left the porch light on from March 1st through March 5th. His mother never took down the "Welcome Evan" sign taped to the refrigerator. His father stopped talking about the case entirely. Grief settled into the walls of their home like a slow, invisible fog. By 1994, the case had gone cold, and by the early 2000s, most people in Silver Brook didn't speak about it anymore, until the flood. In the spring of 2011, after 3 straight days of rain, the storm drains throughout Silver Brook overflowed. Streets filled with runoff, and the town's maintenance crews worked around the clock to clear the blockages. On April 17th, a team was dispatched to a rarely accessed overflow channel behind the old middle school, the same school Evan had attended. Beneath layers of wet leaves and debris, a worker spotted something odd, folded, carefully tucked between 2 iron grates. A jacket, small, green, still zipped. He pulled it free and turned it over in his hands. Faded, stained by time, but unmistakably a child's. He checked the pockets, and there it was, the plastic keychain. The eagle mascot still visible under the grime. He turned to the others. "Call it in," he said. The police arrived within the hour. Photos were taken. The jacket bagged, the keychain labeled. Within 2 days, both were confirmed. The items had belonged to Evan Keller. His mother identified the jacket immediately. The name tag she'd sewn into the collar was still faintly visible, the thread frayed but intact. The news hit Silver Brook like a thunderclap. After 19 years, something had finally resurfaced. And what disturbed investigators most wasn't the condition of the jacket. It was where it had been found. The drain was less than 100 meters from a house once owned by George Halley, a former janitor at Silver Brook Elementary. Halley had worked at the school for over 15 years, mostly during night shifts. Quiet, unremarkable. He had left town abruptly in 1993, citing family reasons, and sold the house to an out-of-state buyer. At the time, his departure hadn't raised eyebrows. Now it did. The police quickly obtained a warrant to search the property, now vacant again after being put up for sale. It had changed hands several times over the years, but the interior still bore signs of Halley's presence. Old furniture in the basement, a few crates in the attic, and a narrow, sealed crawl space beneath the floorboards of the upstairs hallway. Inside that crawl space, officers found a box. Cardboard, partially collapsed. Inside, a baseball glove, a pack of 1991 trading cards, and a small cloth bundle containing crayons, a child's toothbrush, and a faded bedtime storybook, The Firefly Forest. But at the bottom of the box, beneath a layer of dust and torn cloth, they found a folded scrap of lined paper. It was yellowed, torn along the edge. Written in a child's uneven handwriting were the words, He said not to go outside. But I hear cars. I miss Mom. The note wasn't signed, but to investigators, it was clear someone had kept Evan Keller in that house, at least for a time. The child's note found in the crawl space sent shockwaves through the small Silver Brook Police Department. It was the first concrete suggestion that Evan hadn't been killed immediately or even taken far. He had likely been held somewhere close. And perhaps, for days or even weeks, he had been alive. Alive within shouting distance of his own neighborhood. Investigators began a full review of George Halley's life. His employment records at Silver Brook Elementary were pulled. Neighbors were re-interviewed. Even his distant relatives were contacted. What emerged was a pattern of subtle but persistent avoidance. Halley had always been described as quiet, polite, but strange. He'd rarely socialized with staff. He never accepted invitations. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't have a driver's license. Most who knew him agreed he kept to himself. He was last seen in Silver Brook in early 1993, just months after Evan's disappearance, when he loaded a U-Haul and drove east. No forwarding address. No notice. Just gone. It took less than a week to locate him. He was living under a different name, Gregory Hale, in rural Idaho, working at a hardware store, retired, and living alone in a small rented home. When contacted by authorities, he didn't resist a visit, but when they mentioned Evan's name, something in his face changed, just slightly. A tightening around the jaw, a blink that lasted too long. Detective Sloan, who had been assigned to reopen the case, later described a moment as a shadow moving across his soul. Halley, or Hale, denied everything. He said he remembered the case, but only vaguely. He had no recollection of Evan Keller personally. When shown a photo of the baseball glove found in the crawl space, he claimed it was just junk from some old tenants. He claimed the note was planted. He claimed he had nothing to hide. And yet, when asked to explain the presence of the items, Evan's items, in a space sealed before Halley ever left Silver Brook, he had no answer. A search warrant for his Idaho property uncovered no evidence of wrongdoing, no journals, no photos, no trophies, but they did find a single box in the back of a hall closet. Inside it, a copy of The Firefly Forest. Same edition, same torn corner on page 18. Pressed inside the front cover was a folded envelope, and inside that envelope, a photo. It was Evan, older, about 10 years old, smiling nervously in front of a tree, arms at his sides. It had never been seen before. The image was dated August 1994, 2 years after his disappearance. The photo was analyzed, verified, and authenticated. No evidence of editing. The trees in the background were consistent with the Pacific Northwest. Evan was alive years after the world had assumed him gone. The FBI was brought in, and what followed was a slow unraveling of a story that had been buried in silence. Records from a now-defunct orphanage in Spokane, Washington, revealed a boy admitted under the name Jacob Hill, age 10, in late 1995. No known parents. No documents. The boy had been dropped off by a man who refused to give his name. He said he was a family friend. A former staff member remembered, said the boy's mother had died. That's all we got. The child stayed at the orphanage for 6 months before being transferred to a foster home. That boy was eventually adopted. He grew up in Oregon, not far from where his life had begun, completely unaware that he was once Evan Keller. His name was now James Hill, 27 years old. When investigators contacted James in 2011, he was living a quiet life, working in IT, with a small apartment and no criminal record. They asked to speak with him privately. When they explained why, he was silent for several minutes. Then he asked one question. Was it about the jacket? He had remembered it. Not all the details. Not the day he vanished. But the jacket, the green fabric, the yellow zipper, the keychain in his pocket. And he remembered someone telling him to be quiet, to stay in the house, that the world outside was bad. He didn't remember the man's face clearly, but he remembered hiding, and the sound of trains at night, and the fireflies, the same fireflies from the storybook. Over the following weeks, James worked with authorities to reconstruct what fragments he could. Memory, trauma, and time had blurred much of it, but key details lined up: the book, the glove, the crawlspace, the photo, and eventually, the truth became clear. George Halley had abducted Evan, kept him hidden in his house, moved him secretly, possibly to another property, then years later, surrendered him under a false name, far from Silver Brook. No one ever connected the boy to the missing posters. No one ever questioned the story of the family friend. Until now, Halley was arrested in Idaho, charged with kidnapping and multiple counts of obstruction. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claimed the boy must have wandered into his home, claimed he tried to help, claimed he had no choice. But the jury saw otherwise. The photo, the items, the false name. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty, as James, formerly Evan, watched the sentence read aloud. He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes, not in relief, not in triumph, just in quiet reckoning, because the past had returned. But this time, it hadn't come to take something from him. It had come to give something back. In the weeks following conviction of George Halley, the town of Silver Brook found itself revisiting wounds that had never fully healed. Evan Keller's name, once a symbol of grief and absence, was now connected to a revelation no one had dared hope for. He had survived. But the return of Evan, now known as James Hill, was not a simple homecoming. For nearly 2 decades, he had lived under another name, unaware of who he truly was, shaped by memories too scattered to understand. Now, with answers came confusion. With truth came disorientation. James agreed to stay in Silver Brook for a time. He met with counselors, detectives, and eventually with the family he had left behind. His mother, Lorraine Keller, had never moved away. She still lived in the same modest house, still walked the 2 blocks to her mother's home, and still left the porch light on every march. When she saw him for the first time, standing at the bottom of her porch steps, she froze. He looked older, of course, his hair darker, his face longer, but the eyes were the same. The way he tilted his head, the faint, uncertain smile. She whispered his name, Evan, and he simply said, I think so. They embraced without words. Just tears, just years poured out in silence. That reunion was private, with no cameras, no announcements. Only neighbors watching through windows, some weeping, others stunned into stillness. Later that week, James visited the tree-lined street where he had once walked to his grandmother's house. It was quieter than he remembered, or perhaps it had always been quiet, and he had simply forgotten how silence sounded when it wasn't filled with fear. He stood outside the corner drain, the one where his jacket had been found, and for a long time he stared. I don't remember it, he said to Detective Sloan, who had walked with him, but part of me thinks I passed this spot again and again. Sloan nodded. Maybe you did. Maybe he brought you back here. Or maybe you brought yourself. Public reaction to the case was mixed. Joy, sorrow, disbelief. Some couldn't understand how James had never questioned his past. Others asked how the foster system had missed it. But psychologists explained what many don't often see: the way trauma can shatter memory, especially when it begins in childhood. The way young minds rewrite stories just to survive. James had remembered pieces. The book, the drain, the nightlight in the shape of a train. But not his name, not his parents, not the sound of his mother calling him home. In an interview with a local news station, James spoke quietly but clearly. I lived a good life, he said, but it wasn't mine. Not really. Now I have to figure out who I was and who I want to be. He declined further interviews after that. Back in Idaho, the trial of George Halley brought attention to the quiet failures in background checks and the absence of follow-up in cases involving young children with incomplete records. His conviction included charges of identity fraud and long-term unlawful confinement. He received a life sentence. But for Silver Brook, closure didn't come in a courtroom. It came in pieces. The school built a small memorial garden where Evan's missing posters had once been stapled to the front gate. A single bench stood beneath a maple tree with a plaque that read, Evan Keller, lost but never gone. James visited the garden on a rainy afternoon in October. Alone, he sat on the bench, looked out at the falling leaves, and quietly pulled something from his jacket pocket. The keychain, the plastic eagle mascot, now cracked and faded, still clung to its rusted ring. He placed it gently beneath the plaque and whispered, "I remember now." The town held a candlelight vigil later that year, not to mourn, but to mark a moment when a question finally found its answer. At the vigil, James didn't speak, but his mother did. She stood before the crowd with her hands trembling, her voice steady. "I want you to know," she said, "that my son wasn't taken from us. He found his way back. That's the story we'll tell." She looked up toward the stars and added, "We waited, and he came home." As winter settled over Silver Brook, a stillness returned to the town, not the silence of loss that had hung over it for years, but something gentler, something closer to peace. James Hill, once known as Evan Keller, remained in town longer than expected. At first, he stayed in a room above the library, offered by a local family friend. He began visiting places from his childhood, the diner, the school playground, the creek trail behind his old neighborhood. Some of it felt familiar, some of it didn't. But the most surprising thing was how the town embraced him, not as a stranger returned, but as a son rediscovered. One afternoon, he stepped into the small elementary school he had once attended. Though the staff had changed, they knew his story. The principal showed him the old yearbooks. James stared at a class photo from 1992. There he was, front row, second from the left, smiling, arms folded, completely unaware of what was to come. "I feel like I know that boy," he said softly, "but also like I was never him." The principal nodded. "Maybe you're both." The school decided to create a dedicated space in the library, the Evan Room, filled with books, soft lighting, and messages from children about hope, survival, and courage. It wasn't a museum. It wasn't about the mystery. It was about what came after. James donated his copy of The Firefly Forest to the room. He wrote a short note inside. "Somewhere in the dark, someone may still be waiting to be found. Keep looking." Outside of Silver Brook, the case made headlines. National news outlets ran segments on his reappearance. The story of the jacket in the drain, the crawl space, and the handwritten note became part of true crime documentaries and podcasts. But James declined all media requests. He was not interested in retelling the trauma. He was interested in rebuilding his life. He eventually reconnected with his extended family, cousins, aunts, and uncles who had searched for him in '92 and never stopped hoping. One cousin had kept every missing poster ever printed. She showed them to him at a quiet dinner, spreading them out across the table. "I kept these in a box under my bed," she said. "You were never just gone." James smiled, overwhelmed. "Thank you for remembering." In private moments, he continued to piece things together. He visited the site where the jacket had been found. Again. And then the house, George Halley's old home. It had been sold and renovated, but the bones of it remained. He stood across the street and watched the windows, the front porch, the basement light. He remembered nothing specific, but the sensation of containment was strong. The feeling of not being allowed to speak, of being watched even in silence. He never stepped inside. He didn't need to. Instead, he left something at the edge of the sidewalk, a small smooth stone painted with the image of a keychain. Not a memorial, a marker. Back at home, Lorraine Keller began writing again, something she had given up years ago. She penned a short book of reflections titled The Porch Light Stayed On, a collection of thoughts, prayers, and journal entries from the years Evan was gone. It was never published widely, but it became a quiet bestseller in Oregon, a comfort for families still searching. One passage read, "Hope doesn't leave when the person is lost. Hope waits in places you don't expect, drawers, jackets, drains. And sometimes one object is enough to bring everything back." By spring of 2012, James had settled into a new rhythm. He began volunteering with a youth mentorship program in Salem, helping teens in the foster system navigate identity, loss, and belonging. He told no one there who he was, but the kids trusted him. One young boy asked him once, "How do you know what it's like?" James simply replied, "Because I've been a lot of people, and now I'm just trying to be me." That summer, during the annual Silverbrook Founders Parade, James was invited to lead the walk, not as a guest of honor, but as part of community. He declined gently, choosing instead to walk quietly among the crowd, a small plastic eagle keychain in his pocket, polished and whole. As the parade moved past the school, past the drain, and into the center of town, no one pointed him out. No one asked for a photo. They simply let him be. And for the first time since March 3rd, 1992, Evan Keller, now James Hill, felt like he had finally arrived. By the time autumn colored the hills of Silverbrook in gold and amber, James Hill had begun planting roots, not just in town, but within himself. Though the name Evan Keller still appeared in headlines and documentaries, James was learning how to live beyond that lost boy's shadow, not to erase him, but to honor him. The final piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly, not from evidence or memory, but from a former foster care worker in Spokane. Now retired, she contacted Silverbrook authorities after watching a local special on the case. She remembered the day Jacob Hill had arrived at the orphanage, quiet, polite, but oddly observant. "I always felt like he knew more than he let on," she said. "But I didn't push. He flinched at the sound of keys. And whenever we read bedtime stories, he'd pick the same one." She kept a photocopy of that book's cover in a file labeled Notable Cases. It was a firefly forest, with her account corroborated. The full timeline became clear. Evan had likely been held in Hallie's home for several weeks. At some point, either out of fear, guilt, or panic, Hallie moved him to another location or possibly traveled with him. In 1995, Evan, under the name Jacob, was dropped to the orphanage with no traceable paperwork. Hallie then vanished. What followed was a childhood shaped by half-truths and reinvention. But now none of that was hidden. Now it could be seen in full. In the spring of 2013, James was invited to speak, privately without press, to a group of social workers and foster care staff from across the state. He hesitated, but eventually he stood before them, holding nothing but the photo that had helped confirm his identity. "I'm here," he began, "because someone found a jacket. That's it. One object. One forgotten thing. And because someone stopped and paid attention to it, I got my name back." He spoke quietly, not as a survivor, not as a symbol, just as someone who had learned to carry two lives at once. That year, a permanent plaque was placed near the storm drain where the jacket had been found. It read, "For Evan, who was never truly lost, and for all the things we think are gone but wait to be found." The town of Silverbrook began marking March 3rd, not as a memorial, but as a day of awareness. School children were taught about resilience. Community talks focused on listening, on watching for the overlooked, the unspoken. The jacket, preserved under glass, was placed in the local historical society's exhibit, beside a replica of the keychain. James never asked for any of it. He only asked for space to rebuild. And he did. In 2014, he moved to Portland and started a small nonprofit, helping former foster youth trace their origins. His work was quiet, personal. He didn't use his story as a headline, but when asked privately, he never lied. He returned to Silverbrook often, not because he had to, because it had always been waiting for him. And each time he passed that drain, he'd pause, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. Because once, 19 years later, someone saw a folded jacket where others saw just leaves and rust, and it brought back a name, a life, a boy walking to Grandma's house, who finally made it home.